Okay, so today's video is going to have a look at the Hungarian Uprising, which is one of the key to look at the background, and that's in 1945. Hungary was occupied by the Soviet Red Army, which in turn would facilitate a communist takeover in 1947. Hungary had actually been allied to Nazi Germany, so it's different from some of the other satellite states in the sense that it wasn't invaded by the Nazis and then liberated. It actually fought alongside Nazi Germany until 1944. At which point it did try to surrender, it tried to form an armistice with the Western Allies. When Hitler discovered this, he actually occupied Hungary. So, whilst they were occupied, however, they were still technically allies. So, anyway, they were invaded by the Soviets in 1944, conquered in 1945, and become a communist satellite state in 1947. Hungary is led by a man called Rákosi. He's a hardline communist, he's loyal to Moscow. He fought in the First World War, captured by the Russians, became a communist, completely devoted to the ideals of the USSR. And what he proceeds to do is arrest or execute any political opposition, which helps that communist takeover in 1947. So he is very much carrying out the orders of Moscow. Now, by 1956, Hungary is suffering from a number of problems, all of which are going to feed into the uprising and cause it. One of them is that Soviet troops are actually based in Hungary. So the Red Army has soldiers physically based in Hungary, which is a drain on the economy. It costs an enormous amount of money to garrison an army, money that Hungary didn't really have. So they were having to pay out to support these troops, which drained their economy and gave the civilians far less money and a much worse standard of living. In addition to this, the Hungarian secret police were persecuting anyone who spoke out against the state, anyone who spoke out against communism, against USSR, ultimately against Rákosi. And so between 1948 and 1953, 2,000 people were executed and around 200,000 were imprisoned. So the secret police are hated in Hungary, and of course they are seen as an extension of the communist state, which leads to the resentment of communism. There were food and fuel shortages, so there just wasn't enough food and there wasn't enough fuel to heat houses, which links to the next point, which is that the restrictions placed on the economy by communism had reduced the standard of living in Hungary. So ordinary Hungarians had a really poor standard of living, which again didn't convince them that communism was the way forward or that it was a situation they wanted to be in. And sort of topping it all off is after the Second World War, the Soviet Union had forced Hungary to pay $300 million in reparations and to force them to pay money in compensation to the USSR for the damage that had been caused by the invasion, which was led by Germany, but of course supported by Hungary. And so things come to or begin to come to a head in 1953. Joseph Stalin dies, a feared leader of the Soviet Union, carried out mass purges across the USSR, executing his own people, carried out the 5-year plans, carried out collectivization, created a famine in the Ukraine, universally feared by everyone. But he dies in 1953, so that strong leader, which kept people in line by fear, is gone. And he's replaced by a man called Nikita Khrushchev, seen just here at the bottom. He actually condemned many of Stalin's actions. He did something called the secret speech, where he spoke out against what Stalin had done. And he appears to want to reform the USSR. He appears to want to make the Soviet Union different to how it was before. And this encourages people, not only in the West, who see Khrushchev maybe as someone who they can de-escalate with, but also across the Eastern Bloc, in countries like Hungary, which are opposed to the hardline communism introduced by Stalin and want that more liberal lifestyle. And so in June 1956, a protest began against the rule of Rákosi. There were riots in Budapest, the capital of Hungary. And some protesters even ripped down the statue of Stalin. They topple it in a protest against the Soviet Union. And so this is encouraged in part by the secret speech. It's encouraged by the death of Stalin in 1953, that they believe that they can now carry out these protests without the mass crackdowns that would have happened under Stalin. And so in order to restore order, Khrushchev does initially send troops in to end the riot, but ultimately he replaces Rákosi with a man called Imre Nagy, who's still a communist. He's a loyal Communist Party member, he believes in communism, but he's seen as much more liberal. He's seen as the kind of person the Hungarians want to lead them, the kind of person who can find that middle ground so that Hungary will remain a satellite state of the Soviet Union, it will remain part of that buffer zone established by Stalin, but the rioting will end and they will become more loyal because they'll be getting something out of it. And so Nagy comes up with the following proposals. He believes there should be democratic elections, that people should be allowed to vote for their leaders, that they should be able to select who's in charge of them. It shouldn't be the dictatorship that had existed under Rákosi, where it was only the Communist Party and the leader held absolute power. He believed that political prisoners should be freed, okay? And that all those people imprisoned by the secret police should be released. And he also believed there should be an impartial judicial system so that people would receive fair trials. Again, prior to this, if the secret police arrested you, you were simply placed into prison, removed, gotten rid of. Okay, and that's a throwback back to that Stalinist era, where people were sent to the gulags for large periods of time for relatively minor crimes, or even just for the suspicion of minor crimes. They didn't get fair trials, they didn't get a fair hearing. So Nagy's proposing this, and again, the Hungarians are behind it. He also says that the Red Army should no longer be based in Hungary, that the Red Army should withdraw actually back into Russia itself, and so the Hungarians aren't being intimidated by it, but also aren't paying for its upkeep, which again is a massively positive and popular policy. Now, Khrushchev is broadly supportive of this. He doesn't have a massive issue. He's fine with democratic elections up to a point. He believes that political prisoners should be freed. It's one of the things that he began in the Soviet Union, again moving away from that Stalinist era. And he was happy for the Red Army not to be based in Hungary, because as far as he was concerned, as long as Hungary was loyal to the Soviet Union and remained a satellite state following orders from Moscow, he saw no reason why the Red Army should be in Hungary. However, Nagy goes slightly too far. He declares that he wants Hungary to leave the Warsaw Pact. He wants Hungary, in essence, to be neutral. Okay, he doesn't want Hungary to be part of that kind of struggle between East and West. Okay, because remember, the Eastern Bloc, the satellite states, are a buffer zone. So if the West invades, they're coming through Hungary first, they're coming through Poland first. A potential first nuclear strike is going to target these areas. Nagy wants no part of it, but for Khrushchev, it's a step too far. Whilst he could consider democratic elections, whilst he could consider withdrawing the Red Army, he cannot consider the idea of Hungary leaving the Warsaw Pact. And so he's going to take steps to stop this from happening. So Nagy starts off well, but he oversteps the mark, and so we're going to see what happens. And basically, he can't allow them to leave the Warsaw Pact. It makes the USSR look weak, but it might also encourage other countries to leave. Remember, countries like Poland had been promised free and fair elections and hadn't got them. And so ultimately are going to want to leave. Countries like Bulgaria, if they see Hungary leave the Warsaw Pact, would look at that and go, right, we can now leave as well. And all of a sudden, Russia, or the USSR, the Soviet Union, has lost its buffer zone. It's lost that protection against the West. And so, November 4th, 1956, Khrushchev dispatches 200,000 soldiers and 6,000 tanks to crush the uprising and take back control of Hungary. Now, the fighting actually continues until 1957. The Soviets did have an overwhelming superiority. They had the tanks, they had the artillery, they had far more soldiers than the Hungarians did, because they could draw upon the rest of the Warsaw Pact. And so the Hungarians fight back using guerrilla tactics. It's not a conventional war. It's hit and run. It's leaving booby traps. It's fighting from building to building and then disappearing into the civilian population. And that's why it takes so long. But ultimately, they're unsuccessful. They're not able to defeat the Red Army. And the uprising ultimately is crushed. And so the consequence of this is that 20,000 Hungarians are killed in the fighting, and that guerrilla fighting in 1956 and 1957, 20,000 are actually killed directly, and 200,000 become refugees, and they flee to the west. Okay, they move into Western Europe, particularly into Austria, to escape that persecution. Nagy himself is captured and he's executed in 1958, and he's replaced with a loyal communist who's going to continue to track down those remaining rebels. So that liberal leader, that kind of hope that maybe Nagy could reform Hungary and bring it back into the fold, is gone. He's dead, executed, to send a message to any other potential leaders that his ideas will not be tolerated, that while Khrushchev is willing to compromise, he's willing to meet in the middle on certain issues. Things like leaving the Warsaw Pact simply are not on the table, and it's not acceptable. And the Soviet Union looks strong. It's removed a threat to its power. It's maintained its control of Eastern Europe in the face of an armed uprising. And it hasn't taken a backward step. So it looks strong and it looks powerful, and it looks like it can control the satellite states effectively, which again sends a message to the other satellite states that an uprising, that a rebellion, that an attempt to leave the Warsaw Pact is not a good idea, because the Soviet Union is strong enough to defeat them. And in addition to this, the USA looks weak, and they failed to intervene. The Hungarians had actually, to an extent, they banked on US intervention. They thought that if they rose up, that if they fought back against the Soviets, that the USA would send support. And remember, they had promised support to countries threatened by communism through the Truman Doctrine. They had said that they would send some kind of aid, whether it was weapons or money or soldiers, to back up those countries. So the Hungarians were hoping that the USA were going to help them in some way, whether that was putting troops between them and the Soviets to ensure their independence, whether it was giving them weapons to fight back effectively, but it doesn't materialize. So the USA looks weak. It looks as though they're not willing to honor their promises. And so the end result of the Hungarian uprising is a Soviet Union that looks powerful. They've re-established their control of Eastern Europe. They've made sure that no other country is going to consider leaving the Warsaw Pact, certainly not in the immediate future. It's shown the world that its military is powerful and can be used at any moment, and they've made the USA look weak.